Mr Chairman, Mr Deputy Speaker, honourable members, it's a pleasure to be back here working with you this morning. I take this opportunity, since I have a microphone, to thank the honourable member yesterday for his kind prayers and good wishes in relation to a cyclone that was hitting Australia. I hear on the news this morning that although the cyclone was pretty horrific, there was no loss of life. So I thank you very much for your good wishes and your prayers. They've obviously been answered. As the Chairman has already mentioned, this is a very, very important bill that we deal with this morning, the budget bill, often known as appropriation bills. The decision to spend the people's money, which is made by the people's representatives on application by a government that has certain proposals that it would like funded. What I want to talk about, I've got some notes which I issued to you in my little red booklet. Those of you who have the red booklet, feel free to look at that at pages 84 and 85 and a few pages there. I won't be repeating that material here this morning because in sessions like this I think it's quicker and easier to get to the principles with a bit of imagery. But the three things that I wanted to draw to your attention, particularly to start with, some of you might like to note these, are a political examination of major policy directions. Firstly, this is done in all legislatures around the world, which is to challenge a minister as to the main political direction of expenditure across the economy. That's the first thing, and that's done everywhere. Everybody examines that in all legislatures throughout the world. The next thing that happens is that there's a detailed and forensic expenditure of the actual, detailed and forensic examination of the actual expenditure. And this is not done so frequently. It's done extensively in the United States through its Senate committees and through the Australian Senate through their Senate committees and through some Northern European legislatures as well. It's also done in New Zealand and some of the Australian states. So detailed examination of the expenditure and particularly talking to the officers who are spending that money, not just the ministers but the officers behind those ministers. And then the third thing is audit, the examination of the financial statements of government and of departments and of off-budget agencies, government-owned corporations, companies, etc. So three main points: political examination, detailed expenditure examination and audit. They're three things to keep in mind when we're dealing with a budget. I wanted to leave four other points with you to think about, and these 4 points are very, very important for legislators. The first is whether the budget is presented to all members with sufficient documentation so that it can be clearly understood. Do you have enough pieces of paper that explain to you how the money is going to spend its money? The next thing is whether there's sufficient time for the legislature to adequately consider the budgetary proposals. Do you have enough time to talk to the minister about the proposed budget before it's required to be passed? Budgets are always urgent. They always must be agreed to very quickly, and you have to have time to consider all the proposals. The next thing is whether there are sufficient mechanisms to enable members of the legislature to adequately consider the budget and to confer with and represent the views of their constituents. So are there mechanisms that allow you to do that? That's the important third point. And the last important point is, are there mechanisms in your orders to enable you to adjust the budget if you wish to take money from one area and put it in another area? So these are four very important principles for legislators: enough documentation to enable you to understand it, enough time to consider it, mechanisms to enable you to do what you want to do in looking at the budget, and adequate mechanisms for adjusting the proposals. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about the mechanisms which we have in Australia, because I don't want to interfere with your own budgetary proposals and mechanisms that you have in Tonga. I've looked at your orders, and they're very interesting orders, and if I was allowed to take those orders out on Vuna Road, I tell you I could leave spin the wheels and leave tyre marks down the main street, because there's a lot of opportunity in your orders. What they do need, though, is someone to get out there and open the throttle on them. So what I thought I'd do is just show you the way we do it in Australia, and you might see some similarities, and it's the differences that I want you to focus on. Now, the first thing that we're talking about with the legislative consideration of the budget, please forgive me if I turn my back to honourable members, just while I put pictures up. The first thing we're talking about is when we consider the budget in the legislative chamber, this is this sealed debate between members and the ministry, and you're all familiar with that, so I don't need to waste your time about that. What we're talking about is what your orders provide for, which is your rules, I beg your pardon, which is to send it to committee, in your case to a single committee. And then what we do is we start to really get into the detail of the budget, and we've got members of the committee talking to people who are responsible for the budget. In our case in Australia, what we would do is we would have a minister there, and then we would have the secretary of the departments, and then other senior officers and any officers who are responsible for spending would have to turn up and would have to explain how they've spent their money. Now, what we do in Tonga is we do that on a single basis through a single committee. What I want to show you in a moment in Australia is we send it to a range of subject committees. A couple of basic principles as we move into this. The first essential principle is that you can't spend money, whether you're a minister or a public sector official, unless you're authorised by the Constitution. So in the Australian sense, we have a constitutional provision which says no money to be drawn from the Treasury except under appropriation made by law. So the Constitution provides for the budget bills, which then go through the legislature, which then get agreed to. We've got the money, we can do the business, right? So no money can be spent unless it's appropriated by law. So my standing here today is an appropriated act. The morning tea that we have later this morning is an appropriated act. Unless, of course, some church has been very generous and donated it to us. But otherwise, it is an appropriated act, and it must be authorised by the clerk over there. You will have seen all during the week the clerk signing little documents, authorising expenditure. Later on, he'll do an annual report, comes to Mr. Speaker for audit. So every single dollar of the taxpayers' money is accounted for as an appropriated act. So it's very, very important for you as members of a legislature to be able to ask senior public servants at any time, is this an appropriated act, what you're doing? Where is the source in law for you to spend that money? A critical point. It applies in Australia, it applies in Tonga. All right, that's the first point. The reason behind that principle, this slide is actually a slide which I need for senior public servants. I don't think members of a legislature need this slide. What it says is parliamentary examination approval of budget, and why? We've got taxpayers spending money. It comes through into the legislature, and then it comes through the legislature, and the legislature asks committees through, asks questions through, for example, its Public Accounts Committee. Does it all add up? Is there a black and white set of figures? Do we comply with international audit standards, etc.? This affects our national credit rating, so Public Accounts Committee is critical. We'll talk more about public accounts. We also have other questions which are asked in the Australian context. Where did all the money go? Are the priorities right? Did we get value for money? And of course, you know straight away as members of a legislature that there's no correct answer to that. Those are political questions which require a political answer. But once all of that's been agreed to, and the legislature has agreed to the budget, then goods and services go back to the people. But the critical point is, of course, governments have no money. They only have money on trust from the people. And they spend it in accordance with the people's wishes, which are expressed through their elected representatives. Now, the way that we do this, as I was explaining, is we take it we take it from the plenary, from the main chamber, and we send it into the committee. But what we do in the Australian context is we don't use one committee, we use a group of committees, because we have a lot of senators who have a lot of interest in the various topics. So, for example, we'll take it out of the main chamber, and instead of sending it just to a Public Accounts Committee, we'll send it to the Legal and Constitutional Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Economics Committee, Education, Employment, Community Affairs, etc. So we'll have a group of senators who are interested in health issues and how is the money being spent in health. So they'll all go along to the Health Committee and they'll ask their questions there. The questions will be addressed to the Minister and round the Minister and into the senior officers behind. Similarly, we have concerns about expenditure on roads.